Great, thanks, Joey. Great to be here, and thanks for joining me, everyone. Um, as Joey said, I'm a conservation biologist at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and we are a nonprofit organization based in Norwich, Vermont, and our mission is to advance the conservation of wildlife through research, monitoring, and community engagement. A lot of our projects involve community volunteers. Sometimes they're helping to collect data. Sometimes they're helping to design studies or process data or analyze data. So a whole host of things. And I encourage you to check out our website if you're interested in more information. So here we are, sort of in the midst of the vernal pool season in early May. So things are really springing to life right about now. And before I kind of get started with the guts of the talk, I often get asked where people can go for more information besides the great world of the interwebs. There are things called books that I like to recommend. So these two are two of my favorite sort of resources for vernal pool information. The book on the left is called Vernal Pools, Natural History and Conservation by Elizabeth Colburn. Kind of a great armchair naturalist kind of a book. It has a fair amount of scientific information and really great information on the invertebrates of vernal pools. And then the book on the right, Science and Conservation of Vernal Pools in Northeastern North America. This is a little bit more of a textbook type of approach. A little bit more pricey as well, but an excellent scientific resource. And then probably my all-time favorite book is this little field guide to vernal pool wildlife from that you can get from the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Wildlife, their Wildlife Publications Office, for $12. A really great buy. It's full color, spiral bound. It's small, kind of a pocket-sized field guide. That's really wonderful for helping to identify the creatures you find in vernal pools. So a little outline of what I'll be covering today. We're going to start off with just defining what a vernal pool is, what its characteristics are, what its functions and values are. And then we'll move on to kind of the area of my expertise, which is the natural history and ecology of vernal pool amphibians. And we'll finish up with a little bit about some of the conservation issues surrounding vernal pools. And then two of the projects that I've got going on at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, the Vernal Pool Atlas and the Vernal Pool Monitoring Program, VP Atlas and VPMon. And we're just going to touch on those very briefly just to give you an idea of what they are. And if you're interested, you can get in touch to learn more. All right, so let's start off with what a vernal pool is. So a couple of their characteristics: they're small, they're shallow wetlands, and they're isolated from other permanent wetlands. So they don't have a permanent inlet or a permanent outlet. They might have a sort of just an ephemeral outlet where it overflows, or an ephemeral inlet where water is flowing in from maybe another vernal pool further upslope. But they're largely surface water fed. Sometimes they'll have connections to groundwater, but not often. And two of those characteristics, small and shallow, are kind of relative terms. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at some hard data. So these are results from visiting almost 575 pools in Vermont. And a full 90% of the pools that I visited were less than a quarter acre in size. And 2/3 were less than 1/10 of an acre. So they're pretty small. They can be larger. Half an acre to an acre is not unheard of, but they're pretty rare and few and far between. And then as far as depth goes, the majority of pools are between 1 foot and 2 feet deep, 40%. And then another 35% are between 1 foot and 6 inches, or between 6 inches and 1 foot deep. So less than 2 feet deep, the majority of pools, about 3/4 of the pools I visited were less than 2 feet deep, but certainly you can have pools that are deeper than that. I know of several that are 3 to 4 feet deep, but again, those are the exception. And vernal pools are ephemeral wetlands. They're seasonal. They have a distinct seasonal hydrology where they typically fill up in the spring with spring rains and snow melt, reach their maximum capacity, usually around this time of year. And then over the course of the growing season, the pools will shrink in size and will eventually dry out, which is one important characteristic of vernal pools. They do dry out occasionally, maybe not every year. Some pools may dry every year. Some pools may only dry in drought years. But the important feature of that is it limits fish populations, because the wildlife that have evolved in these ephemeral wetlands don't have any defenses against the really effective predators such as fish. Particularly the amphibians that breed in vernal pools. They're not like green frogs or bullfrogs, eastern newts that breed in permanent wetlands or ponds. Those species have eggs and larvae that are toxic, and fish learn quickly not to feed on them. But the vernal pool species don't have those protections against predators such as fish. So the drying of the water body is really critical to its function for these wetland species. And the length of the hydro period is also critical for these same species. So in order to have successful amphibian breeding, it must hold water from ice out for at least 3 months as a minimum, 4 months for the salamander species. So if it only holds water on average for 2 months, it's not going to be successful for these amphibians. It's still a vernal pool and it provides habitat for a lot of the invertebrates, but for most of those amphibian species, it won't be productive. And in general, the longer that hydro period, the greater the species diversity that you'll find in vernal pools. And then what are the effects of climate change going to be on these systems? Obviously, we don't know, but our best guess is that it could have major implications for that hydro period, the length of time the pool holds water. The most climate change scenarios suggest that we're going to have warmer growing seasons, warmer winters, warmer growing seasons, which is going to increase the evapotranspiration of water in the pool, and that we're going to have more severe storms, but longer periods of dry or drought between those severe storms. So it's really going to be the timing of when those severe storms occur that may or may not prove successful for vernal pools. If they occur this time of year and keep those pools full during this critical egg laying and larval development period, then things could be good. If those storms occur later in the summer or mostly in the fall, and we see a change in the weather patterns of spring, as kind of like we're seeing this year a little bit, then it could be a different story for vernal pool species. The last characteristic is that they provide critical habitat for these invertebrates, a whole suite of invertebrates, and a few species of amphibians that we've been talking about a little bit. And it's quite unique in that it's one of the only natural communities that's really defined by its animal community instead of its plant community. So it has to have certain characteristics to be a vernal pool that we talked about: small, shallow, seasonal hydrology. But there isn't a unique community of plants that grow in vernal pools. So we really use the community of animals that are found there to help define what it is. Other natural communities we think of are things like red maple swamps or beech maple forests or a hemlock forest. They're defined by the plant communities that are growing there. Not true with vernal pools. And the more ecologists have studied vernal pools, the more we've come to realize that they're a keystone ecosystem, that they have a much greater influence on the surrounding landscape than you might expect based on their size, their small size, and these shallow wetlands. Probably the best way to illustrate that is to summarize part of a PhD dissertation that was done by Brian Windmiller in Massachusetts, where he estimated the biomass of all the breeding birds, all the small mammals, and 7 species of pool breeding amphibians in a 50-acre forest surrounding a single vernal pool in Concord, Massachusetts. And beyond that 50-acre forest was very, very much an urban landscape. There wasn't much else in the way of natural communities. So it was a very isolated pool. So here's what he came up with by estimating these different groups of animals. For breeding birds, he came up with 13 pounds of breeding birds. Birds are pretty lightweight, so they don't add a whole much to the biomass of a given forest. Mammals, 108 pounds of small mammals. And if I remember correctly, he's talking about gray squirrel size and smaller. So things like squirrels and chipmunks and bats and mice and shrews primarily. And then amphibians, drum roll please. The amphibians, we come up with 271 pounds of amphibians, more than birds and mammals combined. And that can have a huge influence on the surrounding forests, particularly the food web of the surrounding forest, because you're transferring a tremendous amount of energy from the aquatic ecosystem to the terrestrial ecosystem each summer when those little metamorphs, those little amphibian metamorphs, leave the pool as tiny frogs and tiny salamanders. I tend to think of the froglets that leave the pool each year as the kind of like the Cheez-Its of the vernal pool world. Everybody loves Cheez-Its, and a whole variety of wildlife prey on young frogs as they're leaving the pool. They're just bite-sized bits of energy. So other frogs will feed on wood frog metamorphs, but a lot of snakes, lots of birds, including things like grouse and turkeys, as well as some songbirds, and some mammals as well. So really critical in the world of transferring energy. So as I said, a lot of predators out there. Garter snakes probably the biggest predator of the adults as well as the young. Raccoons make nightly visits to vernal pools, particularly in the spring when the frogs and salamanders are laying eggs. Barred owls are probably the most common predator in the spring. They really key in on vernal pools when the wood frogs start calling. It's like the dinner bell is ringing. Here's the Fu Manchu of a wood frog going down. And the vernal pool, the wildlife in vernal pools are really dependent on forest habitat in a couple ways. One, that's where the amphibians spend most of their lives, is in the surrounding forest. They only use the pool as a breeding site, sort of a nursery. They lay their eggs develop into larvae, and then the larvae develop into small metamorphs that leave the pool before the end of the summer. And then they spend the rest of their lives in the surrounding forest. But the forest also contributes to the vernal pool itself in the annual input of leaves. So every year when leaf litter in the fall, when the leaves fall into the pool, they sink to the bottom and they form the base of the food chain in a vernal pool. So species like caddisfly larvae that you see kind of in the middle of the screen that build these little cases around themselves for camouflage, or isopods that are another fairly common invertebrate species that you find in vernal pools. These are detritivores. They feed by chewing up the leaf litter into smaller pieces, and that facilitates the growth of something called periphyton. And if you ignore the lovely spotted salamander egg mass in the middle of the screen there, and look around at the leaf litter, you might notice sort of a grayish fuzz that's growing on the leaf litter and on the sticks. That's periphyton, and it's a nutrient-rich mix of bacteria and algae and fungi and phytoplankton and detritus that is an important food source for invertebrates, but also for the wood frog tadpoles. That is primarily what they feed on, is this periphyton. So the leaf litter and those detritivores that chop up the leaves make the growth, sort of facilitates the growth of this periphyton. And if you don't have that input of leaf litter, if you have a vernal pool in a field, for example, it can still function as a vernal pool, but it's going to not have as much periphyton growing there, and it won't grow as quickly because it won't have that leaf litter to get its start. One of the more amazing invertebrates and really beautiful invertebrates is this little crustacean called fairy shrimp. They grow to about 3/4 of an inch long. This is the knob-lipped fairy shrimp, or Eubrancopus bundii, probably the most common species that we have in Vermont, although we haven't done a very thorough job of determining what species we have and what their distributions are. But they're really fascinating little animals. They spend their entire lives in vernal pools. This is their active period. So shortly after the pool thaws, the eggs of the fairy shrimp will hatch into tiny little larvae like shrimp, and they go through several instars or growth periods before they finally reach their adult size, which, as I said, is about 3/4 of an inch. And they're actively swimming around in the pool. And then they breed. Shortly after breeding, the female will deposit or release her thousands of eggs into the water column where they'll sink to the bottom. And then shortly after that, the adults will die. So they have a very short lifespan. The eggs sink to the bottom of the pool. And then, at least for some species, those eggs have to go through a drying out period and then a freezing before they'll be viable, before they'll start developing. So there can be years where you go to a pool and there are fairy shrimp, and then another year you go and there are none, because the conditions haven't occurred where those eggs will start developing. But the eggs last for decades. They can last a very long time and still remain viable. And there is no free, no terrestrial stage or free flying stage. So how fairy shrimp are distributed or how they disperse from one pool to another must occur during the egg stage. Either in wind can pick up the eggs from a dry pool and carry them on the wind to another pool, or waterfowl can pick up the eggs while feeding in a pool, and the eggs will pass through the waterfowl's intestinal system without any harm. And if they're deposited in another pool, then that's another way you can disperse. So there's not, as I said, there's not too much we know about them. Here's the pools that I know we have fairy shrimp, so they're pretty widely distributed. And I'm sure there are many, many more that I don't know about yet, but we're just sort of starting to take a look at this and learn more about where they're found and what species there are in Vermont. We're going to take a quick underwater view of some fairy shrimp here in this little underwater video that's quite short, but give you a sense of how they move and their abundance. So the fairy shrimp are the orange colored crustaceans, and this will settle down, stop moving quite as much. And they have the white tipped tails that are really makes them a little bit more conspicuous. And they swim very slowly, generally in a very slow, graceful pattern, but they can make quick, very rapid movements as well if they're disturbed or frightened. All right, let's talk about some of the vernal pool amphibians. We're going to talk about these 4 species primarily. Starting on the left, the spotted salamander. In the center, the blue spotted salamander. On the right, the Jefferson salamander. And then the only frog that's really dependent on vernal pools is the wood frog. And all of these species can breed in other types of wetlands. So they can breed in permanent wetlands, beaver ponds, other types of wetlands, as long as there's either protection, sort of shallow areas where fish can't access, or if there are no fish. Some beaver ponds don't have predatory fish populations, but they're all capable and do breed in other wetland types. So we'll start with the spotted salamander, probably the most well-known of these three mole salamander species, and kind of the poster child of the vernal pool movement. Really beautiful animal, quite endearing if you've had the chance to experience them up close. Quite large, 7 to 8 or 9 inches. I've seen them bigger than that. They grow their entire lives. They don't stop growing, and they live a long time. They can live 25 years. So these guys are really pretty remarkable. They, as with all of these vernal pool species, they arrive in the vernal pool fairly early, shortly after ice out. There still might be snow patches on the ground, and they're encouraged to move with the onset of the spring rains and nights that are a little bit warmer, above freezing, mid-30s to 40 degrees or so. That'll get them moving. And they arrive at the vernal pools. Typically, the males arrive first, and the males will assemble in these big communal groups called congresses. And they sort of are like a writhing ball of salamanders. It can be dozens to 100 or more. And they're just basically waiting for the females to come and join the party. Once the female arrives, the female will select a male. They'll move away from the congress, and then the male will deposit these little packages of sperm called spermatophores. And it's a little capsule of jelly with a packet of sperm on the top. And you might see them scattered around the bottom of the pool, just like little white flecks of paint or something. And those are spermatophores. They might be attached to sticks or just scattered on the leaf litter. The female then takes up several of those spermatophores through her cloaca, and her eggs are then fertilized internally. And then a day or so later, she will deposit her eggs. So on the left are the spotted salamander eggs. She might lay anywhere from 1 to 3 masses of eggs, and each mass might contain anywhere from 30 to about 250 embryos. And just to contrast that, Jefferson salamander on the right, their eggs are very small and much harder to see, and they might only contain anywhere from 5 to 30 embryos. So a much different reproductive output potential. Spotted salamander egg masses are quite large, like the size of a baseball, and pretty conspicuous. And then after they deposit the eggs, the adults will leave the vernal pool and disperse up into the surrounding forest, where they spend the rest of the year. And I did a study, well, it's going back quite a ways now, about 20 years ago, where at the Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historical Park in Woodstock, where I studied the movements of post-breeding salamanders, both Jefferson and spotteds, with using radio tags. So I put radio tags on them and tracked them through the summer into the fall to see how far away they moved from their breeding pools. And based on that study and a few others that have done similar things, we know that the majority of the population stays within about 600 feet of their breeding site. And they'll live in the forested habitats around the pool, and they spend almost all of their time in small mammal burrows underneath the leaf litter. They don't dig their own tunnels, but they utilize burrows of small mammals like short-tailed shrews and meadow voles and a variety of mice, even chipmunks. They'll use chipmunk tunnels as well. So there's an interesting relationship that goes on between these small mammals that dig the tunnels and the salamanders that use them. They seem to get along the salamanders really benefit. I don't see much of a benefit for the small mammals since they don't prey on these species. Spotted salamanders have a wide distribution in the eastern part of the US, from the Great Plains east up into southern Canada. And as I said, they can be found breeding in a wide variety of wetlands, from vernal pools and beaver ponds and some shallower permanent swamps and things like that. And that distribution is sort of mirrored in Vermont. It's very, very much found in every town across the state. And now let's compare these two species, the blue spotted and the Jefferson salamander. The blue spotted salamander is more of a Midwestern centric species. It's the mole salamander that ranges the furthest north into Ontario and Quebec. And in Vermont, its real stronghold is the Champlain Valley, and it primarily breeds in valley lowlands. So swamps, some beaver ponds, occasionally, sometimes in vernal pools as well, but it doesn't really get up into the ridge tops and some of the valleys. I mean, some of the ridge tops and some of the mountain areas. Whereas the Jefferson salamander is, its breeding is much more limited to vernal pools than the others, although it can breed elsewhere. And it's a large percentage of its global population occurs here in the Northeast. It's much more Northeast centric compared to the blue spotted, which ranges much further west and north. And it does seem to be more sensitive to habitat fragmentation than the blue spotted. And here are their range maps. So in Vermont, anyway, we're looking at the left, the blue spotted, is you see the real stronghold in the Champlain Valley, as well as some of the Connecticut Valley and southwestern Vermont. And the Jefferson gets up into the central highlands a little bit more and into the upper elevations, although it is found down in the lowlands in the Champlain Valley as well. It's considered a high priority species of greatest conservation need, whereas the blue spotted is a medium priority species of greatest conservation need, primarily because the Jefferson is more dependent on vernal pools than the blue spotted. What makes understanding this distribution of these two species confusing is that there's this really unique situation going on with a unisexual species that consists of only females, and that can breed. These unisexuals can take on the appearance of blue spotteds or Jeffersons, depending on how many genes they have from the parent animal. It's a really complex situation. It really bends our mind as far as understanding what sexual reproduction is, because these guys break all the rules. They usually don't practice sexual reproduction. They practice something called gynogenesis. And so in normal sexual reproduction, you get the offspring gets one set of chromosomes from the mom and one set from the dad. So they each have two sets. These guys, the unisexuals, they need sperm from the male, either a male blue spotted or a male Jefferson's, to activate the eggs into developing, but the eggs don't incorporate any of the genetic material from the male, usually. So that the offspring are all females and they're all clones of the mother. And so, of course, all those offspring can then reproduce themselves. So their population growth is exponentially greater than the normal sexual reproduction. But sometimes some of the genetic material from the sperm is incorporated, but not in the normal way. What happens is that instead of just being diploid, having two sets of chromosomes, sort of adding another set of chromosomes. So it's actually more common with the unisexuals to have 3 sets of chromosomes or 4 sets of chromosomes, and sometimes even 5 sets of chromosomes. So a really fascinating story. This occurred millions of years ago, up to 5 million years ago, and it involves 5 species, these unisexuals. So if you go into their sort of the hotbed for the unisexuals, which is in like Ohio and Indiana, there are 5 species that the unisexuals can steal sperm from, any of those 5. Here in the Northeast, it's just these 2. And what's really amazing is that in one egg mass, you can have different ploidy. So you might have some larvae that are triploid and some larvae that are tetraploid. And you might have some that have extra chromosomes from Jefferson's and others that have extra chromosomes from a blue spotted. So it can be all mixed up in one egg mass, but they're all female. Crazy stuff. All right, let's move out of the crazy stuff into the more basic wood frog situation. Wood frog, as I said, is really the only frog species that's dependent on vernal pools. There are some other species of frog that will breed in vernal pools, namely spring peepers and gray tree frogs. But this is the one that's really dependent. Again, it spends most of its life, like the salamanders, in the forested habitat surrounding the vernal pool. Wood frogs, like the spotted salamander, widely distributed across Vermont. And it's the species of frog that ranges the furthest north, up above the Arctic Circle, into northern Alaska and northern Canada. And one of the reasons it can survive in these areas where there's permafrost is because of a unique adaptation that the wood frog shares with a few other frog species for its overwintering strategy. And hopefully we're going to hear the sound on this little video. But nope, we're not hearing it. So I guess we're going to have to skip the video. We had some trouble with the sound earlier, and it doesn't seem to be working. So I'll just basically explain what this video talks about. But if you have a chance, go to Google, look for Nova now, and the website you see there on the top of the screen, you can find it under PBS Learning Media. Google frozen frogs to watch this video. It's just about 5 minutes long. But wood frogs have this unique ability to freeze in the winter. So they overwinter just below the leaf litter. They might nestle into a little cavity in the soil, covered by leaf litter. And as soon as the temperature reaches about freezing, these frogs will flush fill their bloodstream with a simple sugar, glucose. And then they send that glucose throughout all of their cells, all of their bloodstream, and it acts as an antifreeze. And even though the frog itself will freeze completely, freeze solid like a rock, its brain stops functioning, its heart stops beating, its liver stops functioning, and it spends basically the entire winter frozen underground or under the leaf litter with that antifreeze, which prevents its cells from dehydrating or bursting when it freezes. And slowly, it can thaw and freeze repeatedly a number of times during the winter, but for the most part, it's going to be frozen here in Vermont from probably about mid-November, maybe early December, until about early April or so, when the conditions are warm enough that it will thaw out. It takes probably a good day for it to thaw out and resume function. But its heart will start beating again. Blood will start pumping. Its function, all of its bodily functions resume. And what's pretty amazing to me is that the first thing it does after it resumes function and comes out of its hibernation is it doesn't feed, it just immediately migrates to these ice cold vernal pools that have just thawed and begins calling for a mate. So wood frogs will begin singing. I guess we won't have audio from this either, but here are some wood frogs at the surface of the water. And some of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the sound of wood frogs, but it's kind of a quacking or clucking sound. And that's the first thing they do. They'll spend the first week or so vying for a mate, waiting for the females to arrive. Once the females arrive, the males will anxiously vie for the females' attention. And sometimes the males will grab the wrong species in their breeding lust to find a mate, or even the wrong sex. The males have a release call that tells the male that might have grabbed them to let go, that this is not going to result in tadpoles. But the frogs mate using a position called amplexus, where the male grabs the female from behind. And as the female begins to lay her eggs, the male releases his sperm into the water, and the eggs are fertilized externally, just as they're being laid, unlike the salamanders, which their eggs are fertilized internally. So their eggs are deposited in the water, often in these big communal masses, where you might find hundreds of egg masses laid together. Often that's in the sunniest or the warmest part of the pool. I find it's often the north end of the pool, because that's usually gets the most sun. And each female lays one egg mass, but there's a lot of embryos. You can have anywhere from 800 to 2,000 eggs per egg mass. And by laying those eggs in these communal masses, it tends to increase the absorption of solar radiation and maintains, and they're warmer that way. And the warmer they are, the faster they develop, which is really important if you're racing time against the pool drying out. It also reduces predation. Those eggs in the middle are less likely to be depredated by predators. And it also protects them from temperature extremes. So if you have a freezing night, the eggs in the middle are less likely to freeze. Or if the pool really starts to dry out, the eggs in the middle will stay moist. It's fairly easy to distinguish between these species we've been talking about. If we start at the bottom right, frog eggs don't have an external matrix of jelly surrounding it. So the eggs look kind of lumpy. So those are wood frog eggs. They look kind of lumpy. If you pick them up, they can be fairly fragile. They can fall apart a little bit. So be very careful if you pick them up. Then moving to the left, the spotted salamander eggs are about the same size as wood frog eggs, but they have an external jelly matrix that surrounds the whole mass and holds it all together. So it's very firm, roughly the size of a baseball or so. And then above that is the Jefferson salamander. You can see it's much smaller. The outer jelly matrix is much thinner and looser. So if you pick that up out of the water, it can fall apart as well and be kind of drippy. And then the blue spotted salamanders' eggs are very difficult to find because they're usually laid either singly or in small groups of 2 or 3 or 4. And then the unisexuals that we talked about, their egg masses often have the high proportion of dead embryos. As you see here, the whitish colored embryos are non-viable. They either died or were never viable before they started to develop. And we don't know what causes that. Nobody's figured that out to this point, whether it's sperm limitation or whether it's some genetic mix-up that's going on with these unisexuals, perhaps as the ploidy increases, the number of the multiple sets of chromosomes increases, maybe there's some kind of genetic mix-up going on. Still to be determined. And then there's this fascinating relationship with this very unique algae that grows only in spotted salamander egg masses. And it's also found inside of, actually inside spotted salamanders. The only case of a photosynthesizing plant found inside the cells of a vertebrate organism. Still don't understand what the purpose of that is. Originally, when that was first discovered not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, it was thought that maybe the female just passes the algae on to the eggs, but that doesn't happen. In lab experiments, they've determined that the algae is colonizing the egg masses from the environment. So we're not sure what's going on with the algae inside the spotted salamanders. Excuse me. So the larvae hatch anywhere from a few weeks to a month after the eggs are laid, depending on the species and the temperature of the pool. Salamander larvae have those external gills that are really easy to see. They're predatory. They feed primarily on invertebrates. They have a pretty high mortality rate of 70 to 90%. And that's on average. So that's including years where there's, where a pool dries prematurely and there's no reproductive potential at all. And again, it takes at least 3 months to metamorphosis after hatching. And then wood frog tadpoles, your classic tadpole shape with the big head and small tail, or big tail really. They have internal gills, so you can't see their gills. They do have external gills when they hatch for the first day or two before they're absorbed and they're internal. They're omnivorous. They feed mostly on periphyton, but as they get larger, they will occasionally feed on other animals. Again, high mortality and roughly 2 months to metamorphosis. And when after metamorphosis, towards the end of the summer, late July for wood frogs, maybe early August or so for salamanders, they metamorphose, they're leaving the pool, they disperse into the surrounding forest. They don't go very far for the first, their first few months because they're so tiny. At the top, you'll see a kind of a metamorph that's a couple months old. And at the bottom, a pretty newly hatched, or sorry, newly metamorphosed wood froglet. They're pretty hardwired to disperse away from their breeding pool. You might hear that vernal pool species return to the pool in which they were born to breed. That's not accurate. Some may, but the vast majority of them are dispersing away. Otherwise, there would be a lot of inbreeding going on, and the genetic viability of those pools would suffer over time. And spotted salamanders take several years to reach maturity, probably 4 or 5 years. So those 4 or 5 years are spent dispersing, moving away, sort of wandering the landscape, and hopefully they'll by the time they mature, they'll have found an area where that's near a vernal pool to breed in. All right, let's change gears and just discuss three basic conservation issues surrounding vernal pools. And we'll start with the need to protect the breeding pools. Obviously, we need to protect the breeding pools. That's where the next generation of these amphibians are coming from. And I like to use this illustration to explain why mapping vernal pools is critical. So here's a color infrared aerial photograph from 1991. And in these color infrared photos, The red areas are vegetation that's actively photosynthesizing. And these photographs are taken in April before leaf out. So the areas in red are conifer stands. And then the gray area that you see kind of in the middle, that's hardwood forest. So you can see through the hardwood forest right to the forest floor. And right in the center, you'll see a dark blob. That's a good photo signature of a vernal pool. On a color infrared photo, water shows up as black. And because you can see this vernal pool pretty clearly, there's no streams leading in or leading out of the pool. It's not a pond. It's clearly a small body of water. But if we look at a color infrared aerial photo from 2016 and overlay that on there, you see that vernal pool is completely gone and developed with a house and several barns. And so back in around 2013, I started the Vermont vernal pool mapping project, where we started mapping the distribution of vernal pools across the state. And that's critical to protecting these small ephemeral wetlands that don't appear on other types of wetland maps. All right, in addition to protecting the breeding pools, we also need to think about the forested habitat around the pool, because that's where most of these amphibians are spending the majority of their lives. So there are some great best management practices that are available to follow if you're doing forestry or managing your woodland and you have a vernal pool or other amphibian breeding habitat. So that there are sort of three basic zones to think about in managing vernal pools. So we think of these blue, each of these blue dots are a vernal pool. We have three zones. We have the vernal pool itself. We have the 100-foot buffer surrounding the pool. That's important to take into consideration for the quality for water quality, basically. And then we have that 600-foot life zone where the amphibians spend the majority of their lives. So so if we think about the vernal pool basin itself, basically you don't want to disturb it. You want to keep any kind of logging, machinery out of there, skidders or ATVs or any kind of machinery out from that vernal pool basin, even when it's dry, because you can disturb the lining of the pool if it's a clay impervious liner that's holding the water in, or bedrock. You can disturb that. You may cause cracks that would cause the pool to drain more quickly. So you want to keep heavy machinery out of that basin itself. And you don't want to cut trees right around the edge of the pool. You want to leave those live trees for that input of leaf litter. Within the 100-foot buffer, you want to limit any kind of cutting and maintain at least 75% canopy cover within that 100-foot buffer. That's a minimum. You want to have a very light touch in that area, maintain good water quality, provide good habitat for those little metamorphs when they're leaving the pool, so they have an undisturbed area to move into. And then within the life zone, again, you want to maintain at least a 55% canopy cover at a minimum. A little bit more would probably be better. But again, try to avoid putting in big forest roads when you can, that sort of thing. These are just some of the sort of a quick summary. If you want more information on one last thing, only do any timber harvesting on frozen ground to avoid creating big ruts or areas that could compact soil and create false pools. If you want more information, you can go to our website for these two resources. There's the Forestry Habitat Management Guidelines for Vernal Pool Wildlife on the left. That's from Maine. That's a really good detailed document, about 30 pages long. And then I just put together a 2-pager on the right that just sort of summarizes sort of the basics for timber harvests around vernal pools. All right, and last, you want to maintain forested connections between pools. If you have several pools in an area, you want to make sure you maintain those forested areas between those pools to allow for movement between those pools by the populations that breed in them. You want to avoid isolating pools, which would then reduce the genetic diversity of those metapopulations. So just to illustrate that very quickly, here we have a complex of 5 vernal pools, but the 2 pools in the lower part of the screen that are far apart, it's that distance between those 2 pools in a straight line is too far for amphibians to be able to migrate that distance. It would take years for them to migrate that distance, but populations can reach each other for those 2 distant pools through genetic exchange through the 3 pools in the upper part of the graphic. So over several generations, there's genetic exchange between these metapopulations in these 5 pools. But what happens if you put in a road and you destroy those 2 pools in the center? Then you've completely isolated this one pool on the far right, and it will have no genetic exchange between any other pools. So you've, that pool eventually, the populations in that pool will have a lot of inbreeding, and eventually over several dozens of generations of amphibian generations will lose its genetic viability and start to decline. Okay, and lastly, I just want to mention the 2 projects that I'm involved in at VCE. I have the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas, which is an extension of the Vermont Vernal Pool Mapping Project, where we're mapping pools throughout the state. The Atlas is an online interactive database and mapping tool that compiles and archives data for all things vernal pools in Vermont. So you can go there and view where the vernal pools that we know about are located. You can also add pools that don't exist on the map. In order to do that, you need to first register as a user, and then you can add pools to the map or add data to existing pools. So it's a really useful tool, and will allow our mapping project to continue into the future and be a live, interactive project. And then lastly, well, we'll go back to that quickly. This is just zoomed in on one town in Londonderry, Vermont, just to give you an idea of what you might see. So the orange circles are the potential pools that we mapped remotely using those aerial photographs. And then the blue triangles are pools that have been visited on the ground and have been confirmed as actual vernal pools. All right, and lastly is the Vernal Pool Monitoring Project, or VPMon. And this is a long-term monitoring project where teams of volunteers will adopt a vernal pool, maybe in their community, or maybe on their own property, and they'll visit the pool 4 times a year to collect very specific data following our protocols. They do egg mass counts. They estimate abundance of caddisfly larvae and fairy shrimp if they're found there. They measure, they put out a automated audio recorder to record when the wood frogs start calling, so we can look at the phonology of when the frogs are calling over time and how climate change might affect that. And then they also deploy automatic data loggers that record the temperature of the pool water. That will tell us exactly when a pool dries out and when a pool refloods again, give us an idea of the hydro period of the pool and how that changes over time, and how that can relate to populations of amphibians and invertebrates. So that's it for my presentation. I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you may have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was a wonderful presentation. It sounds like there's a little bit of an echo on your on your screen.
That's okay. Sorry, that's still happening. Is that any better?
It's still there. How about you mute yourself while I'm talking, and then once you talk, it shouldn't have an echo.
Sure.
Sounds good. All right. So the first question we have is, what can we do about neighbors allowing their trash to blow into our woods where we have vernal pools? Asking doesn't help. Are there rules in Vermont? You're muted, Steve.
That's a great question. I really don't know what the rules or laws are regarding trash. I guess I would start with your local select board, maybe, or local government, and see what they recommend.
Sounds good. Please post names of your favorite books. I'll put that information in the email that I'll send out to everyone who registered. The next question is, other than evaporation, what impact does shade have on the pools and their inhabitants?
Well, there have been studies that have looked at pools in open habitats and compared them to shaded pools. And the primary difference is that I recall from these studies is that there's more primary productivity, so more plant growth, more algae growing in pools that are growing in the open that receive more sunlight. And there's also tends to be a greater diversity of species of amphibian species, because you tend to get more pond species of amphibians. So pickerel frogs, great tree frogs, occasionally more green frogs, sometimes leopard frogs that will be found in these vernal pools that are more in the open. They don't necessarily breed in them, but they're moving in to as predators and just to occupy that wetland habitat. So I wouldn't consider them as part of the breeding fauna of the pool.
Okay, so the next question is, how do you put radio tags on the salamanders?
The salamanders are tagged. The radio tags are implanted surgically into the abdominal cavity. So it's a fairly involved process. That's one reason I've only done it once, is because it does impact the individuals. So for the Marsh-Billings study, I radio tagged 6 spotted salamanders and 6 Jefferson salamanders. They all lived throughout the 6 months that I tracked them until they went below the frost line to hibernate. So they're anesthetized, small, maybe a 3 or 4 millimeter long surgical incision. There's the transmitter, which is sort of encased in an epoxy, and it's about the size of maybe the size of a lima bean or a little smaller, is then inserted into the abdominal cavity, and then 3 or 4 sutures, and the salamander's all set. We kept them overnight and released them the next day.
So the next question is, you've explained where the male frogs and salamanders are and that they wait for females. Can you explain what triggers the female start of activity and where are they?
Yep, so the females overwinter in the same areas as the male. There just seems to be a bit of a delay in the females arriving. So the males seem to be a little more gung-ho to get to the breeding pools than the females. So the males might arrive in some cases just a few hours before the females. In some cases, they might arrive a day or two before the females arrive. For the salamanders, my research and other research have indicated that the females will travel further away from the pools after breeding. So the females move further away. So it may take them longer to get to the pool in the spring, but they also don't breed every year. So the female salamanders may breed every other year, or they may just skip a year periodically. Probably just depends on their fitness in the spring.
Great. So the next question is, our vernal pool was charted a number of years ago. Is there a site to view the Norwich vernal pools?
Yes. So if you to view the pools in Norwich, if you go to the Vernal Pool Atlas, you can find a link to it on our website, or just Google Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas. You should find it. And if you go to at the top menu bar, go to search pools, and then you'll get a full screen of the map, and you can just use the zoom in feature to zoom in on the town of Norwich, and you'll see all the pools there.
So the next question is, how can I get my vernal pool in your database? I think you covered that in your presentation, so I think this was asked before that section. But Lynn, if that's not clear, put it in the chat and we'll revisit that. So the next question is, we have several created vernal pools, shallow ponds that are man-made. They teem with life in the spring, but do not have a woody buffer due to their location. Are there any plants suggested to plant on those banks?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can tell you a few species that I would recommend avoiding when you plant. So there are some species that have what are called polyphenolic compounds in their leaves. Red maple being one of them. Pretty sure willows are another, unfortunately. So those are the two I would avoid. These polyphenolic compounds have been shown to they don't kill amphibian larvae, but the amphibians in studies done in lab studies have shown that the amphibian larvae develop more slowly, take longer to metamorphose, and they metamorphose at a much smaller size. So their fitness is lower. They just don't have, the smaller size makes them more vulnerable. They can't hop as fast. They're more vulnerable to a wider range of predators. So avoid red maple and willows. There may be a few other species. If you're really interested, I can just let us know, and I can send you a copy of the papers that I'm talking about.
Great. So the next question is, how important are mosquito or fly larvae in vernal pools for the developing amphibians?
Presumably, they're pretty important for. I'm sure salamanders eat them directly, salamander larvae. But then, they're probably really important prey for a host of the other species that are found in the vernal pool, of some of the invertebrate predators like predaceous diving beetles and a number of some of the other larvae, dragonfly larvae. They probably, many of them feed on the mosquito larvae.
Great. The next question is, what do peeper eggs look like? Do they breed in vernal pools?
Yeah, so peepers will breed in some vernal pools. Their eggs, I've never found peeper eggs myself. I've only read that they lay their eggs singly, usually just at the bottom of the pool vegetation, or if it's in a wetland, like in a sedge meadow or a swamp, just at the like at a grassy hummock, they might hide their eggs, but they're laid singly, so they're really difficult to find, and obviously they're quite small. And peepers breed primarily in vernal pools that have some emergent vegetation, sedges, tussie, grass hummocks, things like that. They like that emergent vegetation coming out of the water. So a lot of woodland pools, or not a lot of woodland pools, have that sort of emergent vegetation.
Great. So the next question is, we have tadpoles in our pond all summer. What are they?
Well, there are any number of possibilities. If it's a permanent pond, Probably if this is Vermont, we're talking about, there are probably the 4 most common species would be green frog, bullfrog, both of which take 2 years in most of Vermont to develop into frogs. So they'll lay their eggs in the summer. Eggs will hatch into tadpoles. Those tadpoles will overwinter as tadpoles, and then you'll have those larger tadpoles around the following summer, and they'll finally metamorphose towards the end of the summer. The other species you might have are pickerel frog or leopard frog. Those are also can be fairly good size, but they metamorphose in a single summer.
Great. Are there setback requirements similar to wetland setback requirements that are mandated by the state Vermont?
Yes. So any vernal pools that have any of the species breeding that we talked about, any of the amphibians breeding, is considered a class 2 wetland. So it would have the same protections that any other class 2 wetland would have. So it would have a mandatory 50-foot buffer around the pool that is only meant to protect really water quality, but that's it. Just a 50-foot buffer. There's no other restrictions.
What might be the difference between a small pool that dries up in the summer and one that stays wet because of rain runoff or a small spring feeding it?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that.
What might be the difference between a small pool that dries up in the summer and one that stays wet because of rain runoff or a small spring feeding it?
Well, I do get asked a lot, what's the difference between a vernal pool and a puddle, or is there a minimum size for a vernal pool? And I'm sure there is a minimum size. I don't know of anyone who's actually done the work to try to determine what the minimum size is. I think it's just a matter of space for the amphibians to be able to lay their eggs and have room and have enough food. But probably the most important characteristic is the hydro period, the length of time the pool holds water. So if it's less than 2 months, then all you're going to have is invertebrates that are going to have successful reproduction in that pool. And in some cases, it might act as a population sink for amphibians. So the amphibians, they don't know how long it's going to hold water. They might lay their eggs there, but those eggs are going to be doomed to having no reproductive success. That's a population sink. It's attracting the amphibians to it because it's a pool, but it's not going to hold water long enough for successful reproduction. So I'm not sure if I answered that exactly, but follow up if you want more info.
Great. The next question, and Steve, if you have to run off for anything, just let me know, because we are a little bit over 1 o'clock, but we got a few more questions. So if you have time, it'd be great to get to them. The next question is, what do you think about creating vernal pools?
Well, I have mixed feelings about that, primarily because I've seen it done a few times where it's basically created population sinks because it's hard to get that hydro period right. It's either created population sinks or it's essentially created farm ponds that hold water pretty much year round. And the danger with that is fish may eventually get introduced to that. So it is a little difficult to recreate the ideal hydro period of 3 to 4 months. It's a useful tool for mitigation purposes, although it seems like just avoiding destroying a vernal pool in the first place is a better option than destroying a pool and creating a new one. So if you can work around the location of the pool with whatever development is going on and avoid destroying a pool in the first place, rather than going through the expense and trouble of trying to recreate it, I think is a better option. But there is a lot of information out there on how to create vernal pools, and it has been done successfully in many cases. So it certainly can be done.
Have there been any experiments related to augmenting water in pools as a future measure against impacts of climate change?
Not that I'm aware of. No. If I think some of the work going on now is to sort of try to think about what pools we should prioritize, what pools are going to be really the most important ones to conserve, and those seem to be the pools that have the long hydro period, the large deep pools that can sustain, in dry years still or can have reproductive success even in pretty dry years. Those are the ones that are going to be important to have. Whereas the smaller, shallower pools that are marginally successful are probably not going to be as viable. But that's a good question. I'm not aware of anyone who's looked at that, but that seems like a good option.
Are the salamanders and frogs susceptible to Rana virus? If so, what harm does it do?
Yeah, so ranavirus does affect frogs. It's pretty common. It's fairly widespread. It doesn't always result in mortality. Where there have been mortality events, it seems to mostly affect the larva. So the tadpoles will have these hemorrhages. You'll see tadpoles that are dead that have obvious hemorrhaging under the skin, and there can be mass die-off events. It doesn't, so adults can carry it, but sometimes they don't appear to be affected by it. I guess there's sort of a low grade virus that they can carry, or maybe it's certain strains of the virus. There's a lot of research going on to better understand it. Salamanders don't seem to be affected. It's mostly turtles and frogs. There have been, several die-offs that we know of in Vermont, one in Norwich, one in up in around the Burlington area, and there have been a couple cases of die-offs of adult frogs this year that have been sent off for sampling to try to determine if it's ranavirus or chytrid or what caused the die-off.
Can salamanders breed in pools surrounded mainly by conifers? Do the needles affect the breeding?
They can. Sometimes pools in coniferous areas the water is more acidic. So it depends on how acidic. So if you're dealing with acidic bedrock as well as, acidic from the top from the conifer as well, you can get fairly low pH, and that can adversely affect the survival of salamander eggs and larvae. They're usually successful, but sometimes it's just a lower reproductive success. So but for the most, particularly hemlocks are not as bad as some of the other conifers that we've seen.
All right, so looks like the last question is, if we want to clean some debris from pond edges, when is the best time of year to do that?
So the best time of the year would be the fall. Fall, clear it in the fall, but you don't want to take everything out. It's good to have some woody material, branches, limbs. Those are important egg attachment sites for a lot of the amphibians. They prefer to attach their eggs to sticks or twigs or grasses or sedges to keep them off the bottom of the pool. So you want to keep some in. You don't have to keep them all in, but I would say fall is the best time, particularly October or so. All right.
Great.
Any follow-ups?
It looks like that was the last question. So thank you so much, Steve. That was a really great presentation, and I know I learned a lot from it. And thank you to everyone who attended. I hope you all are going to leave here with some knowledge that you can go out and explore some vernal pools with. We do have another workshop coming up on June 8th about Vermont forest birds and how to learn their songs and identify the birds by their songs. You can register for that through the same registration form used for this workshop. So if there are no last minute questions, thank you all again, and I'll hang on for just a little bit longer for any lingering questions, and then I'll end the meeting.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right, it looks like we're all good. So thanks again, Steve, and thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Joe.